Have you ever looked at a dying animal and known, somewhere deep in your gut, that saving it might be the last decision you get to make on your own terms? Bill Harmon didn't know that dog would still be breathing by morning. He almost didn't stop the truck. It was Christmas Eve, and the wind off the Nebraska plains was cutting sideways through the cab, rattling the loose piece of trim on his door that he'd meant to fix for 2 years, and never had the money to. He was driving home from the feed store with an empty wallet and a full tank of dread, because in 6 days the bank was going to call again. And this time he didn't have an answer for them. 3 months behind on the mortgage. 3 months of promises he couldn't keep. The kind of debt that sits in your chest like a stone you swallowed whole and can't cough back up, no matter how hard you try. He almost didn't see her. Just a shape in the ditch, dark against the frost, white grass, and for a second he thought it was a black trash bag somebody had tossed out a window on their way to some warm house full of people and presents and noise. But something made him slow down. Something made him look twice. The way you look twice at a thing your gut tells you matters before your mind's caught up to why. And when the headlights caught her eyes, barely open, barely alive, he felt his own breath catch in his throat like a fist had closed around it. He pulled over onto the frozen shoulder, gravel crunching under the tires, hazards blinking red into the dark. He didn't think about it. He just did it. She was a border collie, or what was left of one. Ribs like a washboard under matted, filthy fur. A gash along her hip crusted with dried blood and mud. The kind of wound that had been there for days, maybe longer. She didn't growl, didn't run, didn't even try to lift her head much. She just looked up at him with those eyes that seemed to already know how this story usually ends for a dog nobody's looking for, and something in Bill. Something that had gone quiet in him for a long, long time, cracked wide open right there on the side of the road. He carried her to the truck like she weighed nothing at all, because by then she nearly did. Her whole body trembled against his forearms. He could feel her heart going, fast and thin, like a bird's. What would you have done if you'd seen her lying there? Would you have driven on by, telling yourself it wasn't your problem, that you had your own troubles to carry, that a man 3 months behind on his mortgage doesn't have $400 to spare on a stray dog nobody claims? Or would you have stopped, the way Bill did, not knowing yet that the animal you were saving was about to save you right back? Bill Harmon was 58 years old, and he had buried more than most men his age ever have to. His wife, Carol, had passed 4 years earlier, taken slow by a cancer that ate away at her a little more every week, until there was nothing left to hold on to but memories and an empty side of the bed he still couldn't bring himself to sleep on. Some nights he still reached across that mattress out of habit, before he remembered, before the empty sheets reminded him all over again. Carol had been the one with the soft heart. She was the one who used to fill the bird feeders every morning before coffee, who cried at the county fair when the 4-H kids sold their steers, who kept a coffee can of loose change by the door just for stray cats that wandered up looking hungry. Bill had loved her for 41 years, had married her the summer after high school in a church that had since been torn down, had built this whole life with her. The farmhouse, the land, the son they'd raised together, and when she was gone, it felt like somebody had taken a load, bearing wall out of a house and expected it to keep standing anyway. His son, Danny, had moved to Denver for work years back, an engineering job that paid well and pulled him further from the Plains every year. And he called on Sundays, mostly out of duty. The conversations short and careful the way talk gets between two men who love each other. but don't quite know how to say the hard things out loud. Danny had asked him, more than once, if he'd thought about selling the place and moving into town, or maybe out to Denver to be closer to the grandkids. Bill always said he'd think about it. He never did. The farm, 300 acres his father had worked, and his father before him, had become less a livelihood and more a weight strapped to Bill's back, dragging him down a little further every season. He ran cattle 40 head, give or take, on land that had once supported twice that, back when his father was young and the soil hadn't been worked so hard, and the rain came more regular. He did the work of 3 men because he couldn't afford to hire even one. His hands had gone hard and cracked from the work, knuckles swollen some mornings before the coffee even kicked in, his knees grinding like rusted gate hinges every time he climbed down off the tractor. Some nights he'd sit alone at the kitchen table with a cup gone cold and wonder what exactly he was still fighting for. Carol used to be the reason he got up before dawn. Her laugh in the kitchen, the smell of her coffee, the sound of her singing off key to the radio while she made breakfast. Now it was mostly habit and stubbornness and the fear of what it would mean to let his father's land slip through his fingers after 100 years in the family name, after everything his people had sacrificed to hold onto it through droughts and depressions, and every hard winter this stretch of Nebraska had ever thrown at them. The mortgage had crept up on him the way trouble always does, slow, then all at once. A bad drought 2 summers back that dried up the hay fields to brittle straw, forcing him to buy feed he couldn't afford at prices that made his stomach turn. A bull that cost him $3,000 in vet bills and died anyway, right there in the chute, while Bill stood helpless with his hand on its flank. A tractor repair that ate his savings whole in a single week, the transmission going out at the worst possible time, right before planting. By the time Bill sat down and did the math, really did it, pencil and legal pad and every bill spread across the kitchen table, he was already underwater. And every month since had been an exercise in choosing which bill to pay and which to beg forgiveness for. So when he carried that half-dead dog into his truck on Christmas Eve, he wasn't thinking about any of that. He wasn't thinking about the bank, or the mortgage, or the empty side of the bed waiting for him back home. He was thinking about the way her body trembled against his arms, and the sound she made, not quite a whimper, more like a held breath finally let go, when he laid her across the passenger seat and turned the heater up as high as it would go. He drove straight to the emergency vet clinic 40 minutes away, the only one open on a holiday, the radio playing some tinny Christmas carol he didn't have the heart to turn off. Snow had started falling by the time he pulled into the parking lot, fat wet flakes melting against the windshield, and he carried the dog inside wrapped in his own coat, because he didn't have a blanket in the truck. He sat in the waiting room with his hat in his hands while a young vet named Dr. Reyes worked on the dog in the back. The lobby smelled of antiseptic and wet dog and the artificial pine of a plastic wreath somebody had hung crooked on the door. An old farmer's wife sat across from him with a cat carrier on her lap, and neither of them said a word, both of them just waiting the way people wait in places like that on a holiday night, half hoping, half bracing for the worst. When Dr. Reyes came out and told him it would be $400 to stabilize the dog, fluids, antibiotics, stitches for the gash, a night of observation, Bill didn't hesitate. He didn't hesitate, even though $400 was every last cent he had to his name. Even though it meant the mortgage payment he'd been scraping together for weeks, the one that was supposed to buy him one more month of grace with the bank, was gone in an instant. He signed the papers with a steady hand and a churning stomach, and he told himself the same thing his father used to say when times were hardest. You take care of what's in front of you, and you let tomorrow worry about itself. You sure about this? Dr. Rise asked him gently, because something in his face must have given away more than he meant it to show. No, Bill said. But I'm doing it anyway. He named her Providence before he even brought her home. It wasn't a decision so much as a recognition. Like the name had been waiting for her the whole time, and he was just the one who finally said it out loud. Standing in that parking lot with snow falling around him and nothing left in his wallet but the shape of a decision he wasn't sure yet he could afford. The first few days, Providence barely moved. She lay on a blanket by the wood stove in Bill's kitchen, eyes tracking him whenever he crossed the room, but too weak to lift her head for long. Bill fed her by hand, small bits of chicken and rice, patient as a man with nothing but time and nowhere else he needed to be. He talked to her the way he used to talk to Carol, filling the silence of the house with the sound of his own voice, telling her about the weather and the cattle and the way the north fence needed mending before spring, telling her things he hadn't said out loud to anyone in years. He didn't expect her to answer. He didn't expect anything from her at all. But something about having another living creature in that house, something that needed him, that looked at him like he mattered, started to loosen something that had been clenched tight in his chest for 4 long years, tight enough that he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to breathe easy. By the second week, she was standing, wobbly but determined, dragging herself to the water bowl on her own, even when Bill offered to carry it to her. By the third, she was following him from room to room, slow and careful, her hip still healing but her spirit clearly returning, a light coming back into those eyes that had looked half gone that first night in the ditch. There was an intelligence in her that unsettled Bill a little. The way she seemed to study him, to read the set of his shoulders, and know when a bad day had happened even before he said a word. She'd press her body against his leg on the mornings. He sat too long at the kitchen table staring at Bill's, like she could feel the weight of it coming off him in waves. She started sleeping at the foot of his bed. Not asked to, not invited exactly. She just climbed up one night, slow and testing, watching his face for any sign she should get down, and when he didn't send her away, she curled into the empty space that had belonged to Carol's side, and Bill found he didn't have the heart to make her move. Some nights he'd wake at 2 or 3 in the morning, the way grieving men often do, and he'd reach out and feel her warm weight there, and it would be enough to let him fall back asleep instead of lying awake with his thoughts circling like buzzards over something already dead. Border collies aren't meant to be house pets. Bill knew that better than most. He'd grown up around working dogs his whole life, watched his father run a pair of them on this very land, herding cattle with nothing but whistles and hand signals, and an understanding between man and dog that seemed to run deeper than any training could explain. But Providence had come to him broken, starved and wounded and half a breath from gone. And broken things need time before they can work again, need somebody patient enough to let them heal at their own pace. Still, he saw it in her. The coiled readiness in her body when she watched the cattle through the kitchen window, the way her ears pricked at the sound of hooves on frozen ground, the way her whole frame would tense like a held breath whenever the herd shifted in the far pasture, like some old instinct was waking up in her a little more every day. She wasn't just a stray he'd rescued out of pity on a cold night. She was a dog built for purpose, bred for it over generations long before she was ever born, And purpose was something Bill understood better than most, because he'd been starving for it himself since the day Carol's casket was lowered into the ground, and the whole town had gone home to their own lives, leaving him alone with his. 6 weeks in, she started following him out to the barn each morning, limping less each day, staying close but watchful. Like she was waiting for something she didn't have words for, and neither did he. Bill didn't know what it was yet. He just knew that for the first time in 4 years, he woke up each morning with something other than dread sitting on his chest. Something that felt, on the good mornings, almost like hope. He'd catch himself talking to her about Carol some mornings out at the barn, mucking stalls with the radio playing low, telling her things he'd never said out loud to another living soul. How guilty he still felt that he hadn't been in the room the exact moment Carol passed. Just 20 minutes late from a run to the pharmacy. How he sometimes wondered if she'd waited for him, and he'd missed it anyway. Providence would just sit and listen, head tilted, tail giving one slow sweep across the concrete floor, like she understood every single word. But dread has a way of finding you again, no matter how much peace you manage to build around it, no matter how carefully you've started stitching your life back together. The call came on a Tuesday morning in late January. Gray light barely breaking over the eastern fields, snow still crusted hard on the ground from a storm the week before. Bill knew before he even picked up the phone what it would be about. The man on the other end, a lone officer named Gary Whitfield, was polite in that careful, practiced way that people are when they're about to deliver news they know will hurt somebody on the other end of the line. News they've probably delivered to a dozen other desperate farmers that same week. The bank had given Bill until the end of the month. No more extensions, no more grace periods. If he couldn't bring the mortgage current, 3 months, plus the payment that had gone to save Providence's life instead of the bank's ledger. The foreclosure process would begin, and Bill would lose the land his father had left him, the land his father's father had cleared with mules and sweat and blistered hands 100 years before, back when this stretch of Nebraska was still more promise than farmland, more grass and dreams than anything guaranteed. Bill hung up the phone and stood in his kitchen for a long time, staring at nothing, the coffee pot gurgling behind him, forgotten, filling the room with a smell he no longer noticed. Providence, sensing something in the air the way animals do, pressed her body against his leg, and he reached down and put a hand on her head without really thinking about it, just needing something warm and solid to hold on to. It was the only thing keeping him upright in that moment. He ran the numbers a dozen different ways that week, sitting at the kitchen table late into the night with a legal pad and a pencil he kept sharpening down to nothing, the shavings piling up in a little heap by his elbow. There was only one answer, and he hated it before he'd even finished writing it down. He was going to have to sell his cattle, all 40 head, at whatever price he could get, fast enough to beat the deadline. It wouldn't be enough to save the farm outright, but it would buy him another season, maybe 2, if he was careful and the weather cooperated, and nothing else went wrong between now and then. Selling in a rush meant selling at a loss. Everyone in the county would know he was desperate, and desperate men don't get fair prices. That was just the way of things out here. Had been since his father's time and his father's father's time before that. He'd worked those cattle for years, bred them, doctored them through sickness in the middle of the night, watched calves born on cold February evenings with his own 2 hands, numb fingers pulling a slick newborn calf into the world, while its mother bawled and steam rose off both of them into the freezing dark. Selling them like this, rushed and desperate, felt like giving up a piece of himself right along with them. But he didn't see another road forward, not with the clock the bank had set ticking louder every day. He called a buyer he knew from the sale barn in the next county over, a man named Russ Talbot, and arranged for him to come look at the herd that Friday. Russ was fair as far as buyers went, honest in a business that didn't always reward honesty, but Bill knew what he'd offer. 60 cents on the dollar, maybe less, because that's what a rushed sale always brought no matter how good the cattle looked. It would be enough to keep the lights on and the bank quiet for a while longer. But it would gut the herd he'd spent a decade building up from almost nothing. And it would mean starting over from scratch just to get back to where he'd already been. The night before Russ was set to arrive, a storm rolled through, the kind that comes fast and mean off the plains with no warning at all, the kind old timers say you can feel coming in your joints before the sky ever gives it away. The sky had been clear at supper, stars sharp and cold overhead, and by 9 o'clock the wind had turned hard out of the southwest, black clouds boiling up and swallowing the stars whole in a matter of minutes. Bill went out to check the fence line before dark, same as always, flashlight in one hand, collar turned up against the first spitting drops of rain. And that's when he found the gap, a section of wire down near the county road, torn loose by a fallen cottonwood branch heavy with ice. And half his herd already through it, and scattered along the shoulder of the highway, spooked by a crack of thunder and running blind in the dark toward nowhere good. Bill's heart dropped straight through the floor of his chest. 40 head of cattle, his entire remaining livelihood, loose on a state highway in a lightning storm, with trucks running that road at 70 miles an hour on their way home for the night, and no way for Bill to reach them all himself? Not with his knees the way they were. Not in weather like this. Not with the dark closing in faster than his old legs could ever hope to outrun. Ew. He stood at the fence line with rain hammering his hat brim and lightning cracking white across the sky, and for the first time since Carol died, Bill Harmon felt something close to hopeless. Not just scared, not just worried, but hopeless in that particular way that comes when you can see exactly how bad a thing is about to get, and know there's nothing your two hands can do to stop it. He could hear them out there. The low, frightened bawling of cattle in the dark, somewhere beyond the reach of his flashlight, scattered across a stretch of highway shoulder and open ditch that ran for the better part of a mile in either direction. If even a handful got hit by a passing truck, if even a few wandered onto the blacktop at the wrong moment, when a driver wasn't expecting anything but empty road, he wouldn't just lose money, he'd lose everything. There'd be nothing left to sell, nothing left to offer the bank, nothing left standing between him and the end of everything his family had built across 4 generations of hard winters and harder work. He was one man, 58 years old, with a bad hip and a heart that had already been broken more times than it should have been for one lifetime. He physically could not run down 40 scattered cattle in a storm, not alone, not in the dark, not fast enough to matter. He tried anyway, stumbling 20 yards down the ditch line, boots sliding in the mud, rain stinging his eyes, before his own body told him plainly and painfully that this was a fight he could not win with legs and lungs alone, no matter how much he wanted to. He thought about calling a neighbor, but the nearest one was 15 minutes away. Even if they answered on the first ring, and every minute mattered now, every minute was another chance for a truck to come around that bend too fast. He thought about calling 911, but what would they even do? This wasn't an accident yet, just a slow-motion disaster still unfolding in the dark. invisible to anyone but him, and whatever drivers might come along at exactly the wrong moment. He stood there in the rain, soaked through to the skin, water running in cold streams down the back of his collar, and for one terrible moment he let himself imagine the whole life he'd have to build after this. Selling the house, moving into some cramped apartment in town, calling Danny to say the farm was gone. The land was gone. Everything his father had worked for was gone, because of one bad night and one broken fence. He felt an old, familiar despair rising in him, the same despair that had nearly swallowed him whole after Carol's funeral, when he used to sit alone in his truck in the church parking lot long after everyone else had gone home to their own lives, wondering what the point of getting up in the morning even was anymore. That's when he felt something brush against his leg in the dark. Providence was standing beside him, soaked to the bone, ears pinned back against the driving rain, eyes fixed out toward the sound of the scattered cattle, like she'd been listening the whole time, waiting for him to notice what she already understood in her bones. Her whole body was trembling, not from fear, Bill realized with a start, but from something closer to anticipation. The same coiled readiness he'd seen in her every time she watched the herd from the kitchen window, only now it had nowhere left to go but forward, out into the storm. Bill looked down at her, and for a second, he almost laughed at the absurdity of it. A 50-pound dog, barely 6 weeks off death's door, against 40 head of panicked cattle on a dark highway in the worst storm of the winter. But then he remembered where she came from. He remembered the breed in her blood, the purpose written into every muscle of her body long before he ever found her in that ditch, long before either of them knew they'd need each other this badly, this completely. He didn't have a plan. He didn't have a choice. He just knelt down in the mud, ignoring the ache in his knees, put his hand on her wet head, and said the only thing he could think to say, the only thing that felt true in that moment: bring him home, girl. What happened next? Bill would spend the rest of his life trying to describe to people, and never quite managing to get the words right, never quite able to make anyone understand what it looked like to watch it happen with his own 2 eyes. Providence took off into the dark like she'd been waiting her whole life for that exact command, low and fast across the wet grass, disappearing almost instantly into the rain and the black beyond his flashlight's reach. Bill stood frozen for a moment, torn between following her and knowing full well he'd never keep pace, his bad hip already screaming from the cold and the stress of the night, his hands shaking so hard he nearly dropped the flashlight into the mud at his feet. He made his way toward the gap in the fence as fast as he could manage, breath ragged, rain running down the back of his collar in cold rivers, thunder rolling overhead in long, drawn-out booms that seemed to shake the ground itself. He could hear cattle bawling somewhere out past the ditch, could hear, underneath it, something else, a bark sharp and commanding, cutting through the storm like a blade through wet canvas. He reached the torn fence line and stood there, chest heaving, watching the beam of his flashlight catch movement out on the highway's shoulder. And what he saw next made him stop breathing entirely. Cattle were moving, not scattering further into the dark, not panicking toward the road, but turning, bunching together, drifting back toward the gap in the fence, like they were being herded by some force Bill couldn't fully see in the dark and the rain. And every few seconds, low and fast along the edges of the group, there she was. Providence, soaked and small against the size of the animals she was working, darting in low to turn a stray cow, dropping flat to the ground when one turned to challenge her with lowered horns, then rising again to press forward, relentless, tireless, Like the storm itself couldn't touch her. Like nothing in the world mattered more than getting every last one of them home. She was working 40 head of spooked cattle in a lightning storm, on a stretch of highway, without a single command from Bill beyond the one he'd given her at the fence line. She moved with an instinct that seemed to come from somewhere far older than her short life. Some inheritance passed down through generations of dogs bred for exactly this purpose, activated now in the one moment it mattered more than anything else ever would. A truck's headlights appeared in the distance, coming fast around the bend, and Bill's heart seized in his chest so hard it hurt. So hard he thought for a second it might just stop right there in the rain. He shouted, uselessly, into the storm, knowing there was nothing he could do from where he stood, 100 yards off with a bad hip and empty hands, and no way to reach the road in time. But Providence had already seen it too. She cut low and hard in front of a cow that had wandered close to the shoulder, forcing it back with a burst of speed and a sharp, commanding bark, and the herd shifted away from the blacktop, just as the truck roared past, horn blaring long and angry, taillights disappearing into the rain like nothing at all had happened, like the driver had no idea how close he'd come to changing everything for a man he'd never even meet. Bill stood at that fence line with tears running down his face, indistinguishable from the rain soaking him through, watching a half-starved stray he'd found dying in a ditch 6 weeks earlier save his entire herd with nothing but instinct and heart and a will that simply refused to quit, no matter what the storm threw at her. 2-2. It took the better part of 2 hours, but one by one, the cattle came back through the gap in the fence, pushed gently and relentlessly by a dog running on nothing but adrenaline and purpose and whatever reserves of strength she had left in a body that had nearly died 6 weeks before. Bill stood at the opening with his flashlight, counting heads as they passed, his voice hoarse from calling out encouragement into the storm, from calling her name into the wind like it might somehow carry to her and give her a little more strength when she needed it most. 36, 37, 38, 39, 40. Every single one of them made it back. Providence came through last, limping badly now on the hip that had barely healed 6 weeks before, soaked and shaking and utterly spent, her sides heaving with exhaustion, but with her tail still carrying a faint, proud wag as she looked up at Bill like she was waiting to hear if she'd done all right, if it had been enough. Bill dropped to his knees right there in the mud, uncaring of the rain, uncaring of anything else in the world, and pulled that dog against his chest and held her the way he hadn't held anything, or anyone since Carol's casket was lowered into the ground. He cried into her wet fur, great heaving sobs that had been building in him for 4 long years, grief and gratitude and disbelief all tangled together into something too big for words, too big for a man who'd spent so long telling himself he didn't have anything left inside him to feel. "You did it," he kept saying over and over into her ear, his voice breaking on every word. "You did it, girl. You did it. I don't know how, but you did it." He carried her back to the truck because her legs had finally given out beneath her, refusing to hold her weight a moment longer now that the job was done, and he drove home with her wrapped in a dry blanket on the seat beside him, checking on her every few seconds like he was afraid the whole night had been some kind of fevered dream he'd wake up from before it was finished. He sat with her in the barn for another hour after they got home, toweling her off by lantern light, just making sure she was breathing steady, just making sure the storm hadn't taken something from her that he wouldn't be able to give back this time. Word got around fast in a county that small, the way it always does. By Sunday, Half the town had heard about the border collie who'd single-handedly herded 40 head of cattle back off a stormy highway in the dark, and people who'd never had 2 words to say to Bill Harmon at the feed store were suddenly stopping him in the aisles to ask if the stories were true, shaking their heads when he told them yes, every word of it. Russ Talbot showed up Friday morning to look at the herd, took one look at 40 healthy and injured cattle standing calm in the pasture, not a scratch on a single one of them, and shook his head in disbelief when Bill told him the story from start to finish, standing there in his barn coat with his hat pushed back. "I've bought and sold cattle for 30 years, Russ said, quiet, almost reverent. Never heard of anything like that in all that time. Bill still sold some cattle that month, because the bank still needed paying, and reality doesn't bend just because a miracle happened the night before. But he sold on his own terms, at a fair price, to a buyer he trusted, keeping back enough breeding stock to rebuild the herd properly over the coming seasons, instead of gutting it entirely out of desperation. It wasn't everything he'd hoped for, but it was enough. It was enough to keep the bank at bay, enough to keep the land in his family's name, enough to give him a foundation to build back from instead of an ending to grieve over for the rest of his days. Spring came slow that year, the way it always does on the plains, but it came. Bill Harmon stood at his kitchen window one morning in April, coffee in hand, steam curling up past his face, watching Providence trot the fence line with the easy confidence of a dog fully healed and fully home. And he thought about how close he'd come to driving past her, in that ditch on Christmas Eve, how different every single day since would have been if he'd just kept his foot on the gas. He thought about the $400 he didn't have, spent on a dying stray, instead of a mortgage payment that felt, at the time, like the only responsible choice a desperate man could make. He thought about how many people would have called that decision foolish, sentimental, the kind of thing a man does when grief has worn away his good sense and left nothing but soft-headed impulse behind it. But he knew better now. He knew that some decisions aren't about the math scratched out on a legal pad at midnight. Some decisions are about who you choose to be in the moment when nobody's watching, when there's nothing in it for you but the simple, stubborn refusal to let something suffer when you have the power to help it instead, even if helping costs you the very thing you were trying to protect. Providence had given him back more than she could ever know. Not just a working dog, not just a farm saved from the bank, but a reason to get up every morning that had nothing to do with duty or habit, and everything to do with love, real love. The kind he thought he'd buried along with Carol. Carol would have loved her, Bill thought often, standing at that window with his coffee going cold in his hand. Carol always did have a soft spot for strays, human and animal alike, always the one bringing home half, drowned kittens and injured birds, when they were young, and just starting out on this land together. Bill liked to think that somewhere, she'd had a hand in putting that dog in his path that night, in that ditch, on Christmas Eve, right when he needed her most, right when he was closest to giving up on all of it. Danny came to visit that summer, drove 12 hours straight from Denver, because he said he had to see it with his own eyes, had to see the dog people back home were still talking about months later. He stood in the yard watching Providence work a small group of cattle through a gate, with the kind of precision that took most working dogs years to develop, her body low and quick, her eyes locked on the herd like nothing else in the world existed in that moment. He looked at his father, tanned and steady and more alive than he'd seemed in years, color back in his face, a lightness in his step that Danny hadn't seen since before his mother got sick, and said quietly, "She saved you too, didn't she, Dad?" Not just the farm. Bill just nodded, because there wasn't a way to say it out loud that wouldn't break his voice completely. That night, father and son sat out on the porch until well past dark, fireflies blinking low over the pasture. Providence stretched out between their chairs with her chin on her paws, and for the first time in 4 years, they talked about Carol without either of them having to look away from the conversation, without either of them changing the subject when it got too heavy to hold. 2. There's an old saying about how you can't put a price on loyalty, and Bill Harmon used to think that was just something people said to feel better about the things money can't buy. Now he knows better. He knows that $400 he didn't have bought him something worth more than the farm itself. It bought him proof that kindness, given freely, even when it costs you everything you've got left to give, has a way of finding its way back to you, exactly when you need it most, in a form you never could have predicted. Providence still sleeps at the foot of his bed every night, older now, a little gray around her muzzle, but still first to the door every morning, still watching the cattle through the kitchen window, with that same coiled readiness that saved everything Bill had left to lose on one stormy night in January. Some mornings Bill still catches himself talking to her about Carol, and some mornings, he swears, she looks at him like she already knows every word before he says it. Maybe you've had a moment like that in your own life. A moment where you gave everything you had left to something that seemed hopeless, not knowing yet whether it would break you completely or save you in ways you couldn't have imagined. Maybe you've got an animal of your own who came into your life at the exact moment you needed them most, for reasons you couldn't explain then and still can't fully explain now, even after all these years. If you have, we'd love to hear about it. Tell us in the comments. What's the name of the animal who changed your life? And how did they find their way to you when you needed them most? And if you believe, like Bill does, that some things in this life are simply meant to happen, that some meetings aren't accidents at all, but something closer to a gift, tell us that too, down in the comments below. If you love these kinds of human and animal bond stories, hit that subscribe button, because we bring you a new story in every video that will touch your heart. Give this one a like if it moved you, share it with someone who needs to believe in miracles again. And we'll see you in the next story